Lieutenant James Howell felt the P-47 Thunderbolt shudder, heard metal tear behind his seat, smelled cordite mixing with engine oil. 3 BF-109s circled above him like wolves around wounded prey. His airspeed indicator showed 280 miles per hour and dropping. His altitude read 8,000 feet over the French countryside. Every manual, every instructor, every veteran pilot he'd ever met said the same thing. Speed is life. Altitude is insurance. Never slow down when you're being chased. James Howell reached forward and pulled the throttle back. The engine note changed from a roar to a threatening growl. The Thunderbolt began to decelerate. The lead German pilot, expecting the American to dive or turn hard, suddenly faced a problem no training had prepared him for. What happened in the next 44 seconds would be studied in tactical aviation courses for the next 30 years. But in that moment, 3 veteran Luftwaffe pilots thought they were simply watching an amateur make his final mistake. If you want more true stories of impossible moments from World War II, subscribe to the channel. This was April 17th, 1944, over occupied France, 12 miles southwest of Reims. The mission had seemed routine that morning during briefing. 8th Air Force Command wanted the 56th Fighter Group to provide close escort for B-17 bombers hitting rail yards that supplied German defensive positions along the Atlantic Wall. The invasion everyone knew was coming would need those rail lines cut. The bombers would be vulnerable during their approach. That's where the fighters came in. 24 P-47 Thunderbolts took off from RAF Boxstead that morning under clear skies. James Howell flew in the second flight, tail-end Charlie position, the spot where new pilots usually got placed. He was 23 years old. He'd been in England for 7 weeks. This was his 9th combat mission. The other pilots in his squadron called him Professor because before the war he'd been studying aeronautical engineering at Purdue University. He wore glasses. He was thin. He asked too many questions during briefings about air pressure differentials and relative wind angles. The nickname wasn't meant as a compliment. His flight commander, Captain Roy McKendrick, had pulled him aside 2 days earlier in the operations tent. McKendrick was a veteran with 11 confirmed kills, a man whose leather jacket was soft from wear and whose eyes carried the weight of 37 missions. He'd watched Howell in training flights, seen him practice maneuvers alone when the others were drinking at the officers' club. "You fly like you're solving an equation, Lieutenant," McKendrick had said, not quite making it sound like criticism. But combat isn't a math test. You need to react, not think. Howell had nodded, said nothing. He understood what McKendrick meant, but he also understood something McKendrick didn't. That reaction without thought was just panic with a different name. The formation crossed the English Channel at 22,000 feet. The bomber stream stretched ahead of them like a steel river flowing east. More than 100 B-17s, stacked in tight combat boxes, their contrails riding white lines across blue sky. The Thunderbolts wove back and forth above and around them, hunting for threats. Radio chatter stayed minimal, professional. They crossed into French airspace at 0947 hours. The French countryside looked peaceful from altitude. Green fields divided by stone walls and tree lines. Villages with church steeples. Roads that traced ancient property boundaries. You could almost forget there was a war until you saw the bombed-out bridges and the burn scars where towns used to stand. The German fighters came up at 1,018 hours. Someone on the radio said, "Bandits, 3 o'clock high, 8 contacts." Howell's eyes snapped to the right. 8 dark shapes dropped out of the sun, falling toward the bomber formation like stones. Messerschmitt Bf-109s, the Luftwaffe's best. They weren't interested in tangling with fighters. Their job was to break up the bomber stream, to kill the big 4-engine birds carrying the actual ordnance. McKendrick's voice cut through the radio. "Blue flight engage. Stay with your wingman." The Thunderbolts rolled into attack position. Howell pushed his throttle forward, felt the big Pratt and Whitney radial engine respond with a surge of power that pressed him back into his seat. The P-47 was heavy, over 7 tons fully loaded, but that big engine gave it speed and diving power. He followed his element leader, Lieutenant Danny Cormack, into a diving left turn to intercept. The Messerschmitts scattered as the American fighters came down. This was a standard game. German fighters tried to slash through the bombers, while American fighters tried to intercept them before they could make their attack runs. It was geometry and timing, angles and energy management, physics expressed in tracer fire and burning aluminum. Howell locked onto a 109 that had broken right. He pulled lead, squeezed the trigger. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted, their recoil shaking the airframe. Brass casings ejected from the wing gun ports in golden streams. Tracers reached out across empty air. The 109 broke hard left, reversing. Howell's burst went behind it. Miss. He'd fired too soon. Hadn't properly accounted for deflection angle. Classic rookie mistake. He pulled up, tried to reposition. His wingman, Cormac, radioed. "Stay with me, Professor. Don't chase." But the formation had already dissolved into individual fights. Planes twisted through three-dimensional space, each pilot hunting or being hunted. The bombers droned on toward their target, ignoring the fighter battle happening around them. Their job was to fly straight and level no matter what. The fighter pilot's job was to make sure they survived long enough to do it. Howell found himself alone at 16,000 feet, his element leader nowhere in sight. The radio screamed with overlapping voices. "Brake right. On your 6. I'm hit. Where did he go?" He turned his head constantly, checking mirrors, scanning sky, trying to build situational awareness from glimpses and fragments. That's when he saw them. 3 BF 109s, stacked in a climbing turn, moving into attack position behind a lone P, 47 3,000 feet below. The Thunderbolt was Cormac's plane, identifiable by the yellow cowling his crew chief had painted 2 weeks earlier. Cormac hadn't seen them. He was focused forward, probably tracking a different target. Howell didn't hesitate. He rolled inverted, pulled the nose down dove. The altimeter unwound. 15,000 feet. 14,000, the engine screamed. Wind noise built to a hurricane roar around the canopy. 13,000 feet. He was approaching terminal velocity for AP 47 in a dive, nearly 550 miles per hour. The point where control surfaces started to stiffen and the plane wanted to shake itself apart. He pulled out at 11,000 feet, his vision narrowing from G-force, blood draining from his head, the world turning gray at the edges. But he gained speed and position. He came up behind the trailing 109 with every advantage. Altitude converted to energy, the sun behind him, the element of surprise. He fired from 400 yards, too far for guaranteed hits, but close enough to get the German pilot's attention. The 109 broke hard right, ruining the attack formation. The other 2 Germans saw Howell and abandoned their attack on Cormac to deal with this new threat. Now 3 experienced German pilots focused entirely on killing one American who just announced himself with tracers. The lead 109 came around in a tight climbing turn, trying to get above Howell. The second 109 went low, setting up a pincer. The third held back, probably the flight leader, watching and waiting to exploit whatever mistake Howell made. These weren't novices. Their maneuvering showed coordination and discipline. They'd done this before. Howell broke left, trying to extend, to gain distance and reset the engagement. But the Germans anticipated it. The high 109 rolled into a dive, cutting off his escape angle. The low 109 pulled up, closing the trap from below. Howell's instruments showed him the geometry of his own death. 2 enemies converging, closure rate over 600 miles per hour combined, guns tracking. He reversed hard right, pulling so many GS that his vision tunneled to a gray pinpoint. The airframe groaned. The turn was too tight, almost past the aircraft's structural limits, but it threw off the Germans' aim. Their cannon shells passed behind him, white tracers drawing lines through the space where he'd been a second earlier. But the third 109, the patient one, had positioned perfectly during all this maneuvering. It sat 1,500 feet behind and 500 feet above Howell, in the classic fighter pilot's position of advantage. The 6 o'clock high that every pilot feared. Howell saw it in his mirror, a dark shape with wings, death in mechanical form. The German opened fire. Cannon shells are different from machine gun bullets. They explode. The first rounds hit Howell's left wing, blew 2-foot holes in the aluminum skin. The second burst walked up the fuselage. One shell punched through the armor plate behind his seat, close enough that he felt the heat. His engine oil pressure gauge flickered. That was bad. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R-2800 was reliable, nearly indestructible, but it still needed oil. Without it, the engine would seize in minutes, maybe less. The radio crackled, Cormac's voice distant. "Professor, where are you?" Howell didn't answer. He was busy trying not to die. He pushed the nose down, dove again, trading altitude for speed. The three 109s followed. They had patience. They didn't need to rush. Their prey was damaged, leaking oil, running out of options. They could afford to be methodical. 8,000 feet. Howell leveled off. The French countryside rose up below him in sharp detail now. Individual trees, farm buildings, a road with a truck moving along it. Too low. If he went much lower, he'd have no room to maneuver, no altitude to trade for energy. The three Messerschmitts spread out into a wide formation behind him. They were setting up for a textbook bracket attack. One would force him to turn. The others would be waiting at the end of his turn with clear shots. It's how you kill a damaged plane that can't run and can't outclimb you. Howell's hand rested on the throttle. His engineering mind calculated airspeed, drag coefficient, power-to-weight ratio, energy state. The Germans expected him to run. That's what every pilot did when outnumbered and damaged. Run for home. Call for help. Hope your plane held together long enough to reach friendly territory. But running required speed. Speed required power. Power meant engine stress. His damaged engine wouldn't survive a sustained maximum power run. The oil pressure was already dropping. Even if the Germans didn't shoot him down, his engine would fail before he reached the channel. So running was death. Fighting three aircraft was death. There was a third option, though. An option that existed only in theory, in equations he'd studied, in principles of relative motion and energy management that most pilots understood intuitively but never articulated. The lead 109 was starting its attack run, coming down from Howell's 7 o'clock high. The pilot would be looking at his gun sight, calculating deflection, waiting for his targeting pipper to align with the P-47's canopy. James Howell reached forward and pulled the throttle back to idle. The engine note dropped from a roar to a rumble. The Thunderbolt began to decelerate. Airspeed 280 miles per hour, 270, 260. The plane felt heavy, mushy, on the edge of losing the lift that kept it in the sky. The lead Messerschmitt pilot had been tracking a target moving at 280 miles per hour. His brain, his reflexes, his gun sight calculations were all based on that speed. He'd positioned himself for an intercept based on closure rate and deflection angle. He was committed to the attack run, diving at nearly 400 miles per hour, his finger tightening on the firing button. Then his target suddenly shed 80 miles per hour in 3 seconds. The Germans' overtake speed went from manageable to catastrophic. His 109 hurtled toward the P-47 like a train approaching a stopped car. He had perhaps 2 seconds to process what was happening, to recognize that his carefully calculated attack had just turned into a high-speed collision course. Howell felt time stretch. He watched the 109 grow larger in his rearview mirror, watched the German pilot make the only choice available, break off, pull up hard, overshoot to avoid ramming the American fighter. The Messerschmitt flashed past Howell's canopy less than 50 feet away. So close he could see the pilot's face through the greenhouse canopy, see the yellow nose paint, see the exhaust stains on the cowling. The German was pulling so many GS that his plane was shaking, the wings flexing, the airframe protesting. In that frozen moment, as the 109 passed in front of him, James Howell had a shot. He was still traveling at 250 miles per hour. The 109 was decelerating hard, bleeding energy in the emergency pull-up. For exactly 3 seconds, they were in the same piece of sky, moving in the same direction. Their relative speed almost matched. Howell pushed the throttle forward, felt the engine respond. He pulled lead, squeezed the trigger. 8 machine guns hammered. The range was less than 200 feet. At that distance, even average marksmanship was lethal. The .50 caliber rounds hit the 109's engine cowling, the wing root, the cockpit. Metal sparked. The canopy shattered. Smoke poured from the engine. The Messerschmitt rolled left, out of control, trailing black smoke and pieces of itself. It fell away toward the French fields below, tumbling, a dead thing obeying only gravity. Howell didn't watch it fall. The second 109 was already adjusting, coming around for its attack. But the German pilot had just watched his flight leader get killed by a maneuver that violated every principle of fighter combat. He was cautious now, uncertain, trying to understand what had just happened. Howell pushed the throttle forward to maximum power. His oil pressure gauge sat in the red zone, the needle bouncing with each engine revolution. He had minutes, maybe less, before catastrophic failure. But he needed speed for what came next. The second 109 positioned for a beam attack, coming in from Howell's 3 o'clock position, trying to avoid the overtake trap that had killed the first German. The pilot was good. He adjusted his approach speed, gave himself more distance, set up for a deflection shot that would let him fire and break away without overcommitting. Howell waited. The 109 closed to 800 yards, 600 yards. The Germans' cannon opened fire. Shells traced through the air, bright points of light that expanded as they approached. Howell could calculate their trajectory, could see where they would pass. Slightly behind him, the German was leading too much, overcompensating. At 400 yards, Howell snapped the P-47 into a hard left brake, directly toward the attacking 109. It was the opposite of what defensive doctrine taught. You're supposed to break away from an attacker, to deny him a shot angle. Breaking into an attack accepted greater risk, but collapsed the geometry of the engagement. The German pilot saw the American turn toward him and made a split-second decision. He could continue his attack and risk a head-on exchange, or he could break off and reset. Head-on attacks were suicide gambles, where both planes often died. The smart play was to break. He broke. Howell reversed his turn, rolling right, keeping his energy up. The second 109 extended away, climbing, trying to regain position, but the energy state had shifted. Howell had seized initiative through pure aggression, through doing what wasn't expected. The third Messerschmitt, the flight leader who'd been hanging back, now faced a problem. He'd expected his two wingmen to finish this damaged American easily. Instead, one was dead and the other was defensive, trying to reset the engagement. The American, despite his battle damage, was maneuvering with confidence and precision. The German flight leader was a veteran. He'd survived 2 years of combat over Russia, North Africa, and now France. He understood when geometry and energy favored him and when they didn't. Right now, they didn't. The American was clearly willing to accept collision-level risk. He'd already proven he wouldn't follow predictable patterns. And the German leader's fuel gauge showed he had perhaps 20 minutes before he needed to break off for home. He made the calculation every combat pilot eventually makes: live to fight another day. The third 109 rolled away, dove for the deck, and extended east toward German-controlled airspace. The second 109 saw his leader depart and followed immediately. They didn't run in panic. They withdrew with discipline, building speed and distance, making themselves difficult targets. Howell watched them go. He didn't pursue. His oil pressure gauge was nearly at zero. His engine temperature was climbing into the danger zone. White smoke trailed from his cowling now, mixing with the black smoke that meant oil was burning somewhere in the engine compartment. He turned west, toward England, toward home. His altitude was 6,000 feet. The English Channel was 90 miles away. His engine had maybe 15 minutes left. The math wasn't promising. The radio crackled. "Any aircraft, this is Falcon Lead. I have a lone P-47 heading west trailing smoke. Identify yourself." Howell keyed his microphone. "Falcon Lead, this is Blue 4. I'm damaged, engine failing, heading for home field." A pause. Then Captain McKendrick's voice. "Blue 4, say your position." Howell read off his coordinates. McKendrick responded immediately. "Copy Blue 4. I'm 12 miles northeast of you with 2 aircraft. We're coming to you. Stay on this heading." 3 minutes later, Howell saw them. 3 P-47s, McKendrick's flight, dropping down from altitude to form up on his wings. McKendrick pulled alongside. close enough that Howell could see him through his canopy. The captain looked at the damage to Howell's aircraft, the holes in the wing, the smoke trailing from the engine, and keyed his radio. "Jesus, Professor, what happened to you?" "I got bounced by 3 109s, Howell said. His voice was steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. "Got one confirmed. The other 2 broke off." Silence on the radio for a moment. Then McKendrick, "Say again, you got one?" "Confirmed. Saw it go down smoking." Another pause. McKendrick was probably trying to reconcile the shot-up aircraft flying beside him with the claim of a kill against a 3-plane element. Finally, "Copy that, Blue 4. We'll sort it out on the ground. Right now, let's get you home." They flew west in formation. Howell's engine temperature continued to climb. At 8,000 feet, the oil pressure gauge hit 0 and stayed there. The engine began to run rough, misfiring, the propeller arc becoming irregular, metal on metal somewhere deep inside, bearing surfaces grinding without lubrication. At 5,000 feet, 10 miles from the English coast, the engine seized. One moment it was running, rough but functional. The next moment it locked solid, the propeller stopping mid-rotation with a sound like a hammer hitting an anvil. The sudden deceleration threw Howell forward against his shoulder straps. The nose dropped. The aircraft transitioned from powered flight to glider. McKendrick's voice. "Blue 4, say your status." "Engine's gone. I'm gliding. I've got the coast in sight." "Copy. We're with you. You've got maybe 4 minutes of glide time. There's an emergency strip at Manston, bearing 275, 8 miles. Can you make it?" Howell did the math in his head. 8 miles. Current altitude 4,500 feet. Glide ratio for AP-47 with a dead engine was approximately 110, meaning for every mile forward he'd lose 1,000 feet of altitude. 8 miles would cost him 8,000 feet. He had 4,500. "Negative," he said. "I'll be in the water 4 miles short." He could see the channel now. Steel gray water with white caps. Cold water. A pilot could survive maybe 20 minutes in it before hypothermia killed him, if the impact didn't kill him first. Ditching AP-47 was notoriously difficult. The big radial engine acted like an anchor, pulling the nose down. Most ditching attempts ended with the plane flipping inverted on impact. But there was one other option. "Falcon lead," Howell said. "There's an auxiliary field at Hawkinge, bearing 260, 5 miles from the coast. If I can make the coast, I can make Hawkinge." Blue 4. Hawkinge is a grass strip, only 2,800 feet. You need at least 4,000 feet to land a Thunderbolt safely. "I can do it." A longer pause this time. McKendrick was probably weighing options, calculating risks. Finally, "Your call, Professor. We're with you either way." Howell trimmed the nose up slightly, trading speed for a shallower glide angle. The P-47 descended through 3,000 feet. The English coast was 3 miles ahead. He could see the white chalk cliffs, the green fields beyond, the dark line that was the fence separating Hawkinge airfield from the surrounding farmland. 2,000 feet, 2 miles from the coast. The wind was from the west, pushing him. That helped. Every bit of wind assistance extended his glide range. 1,000 feet. He crossed the coastline at 800 feet of altitude, the cliffs passing beneath his wings in a blur of white stone and brown mud. The airfield was dead ahead, a rectangle of green grass with a windsock snapping in the breeze. 500 feet. He could see ground crew running toward the field's edge, looking up, watching. He deployed landing gear. The hydraulic system still had pressure from the backup accumulator. 3 green lights. Nose wheel down, left main down, right main down. 300 feet. He lined up with the grass strip. No runway lights, no tower. No guidance except his own judgment and training. He was coming in fast, too fast, but he had no throttle to adjust, no engine to power through a mistake. One approach, one chance. 200 feet. The fence at the field's edge passed beneath him. 100 feet. He flared, pulling the nose up, bleeding speed, converting forward velocity into lift, trying to hold the plane just above stall speed for as long as possible. 50 feet. The stall warning buffeted the airframe. The controls went mushy. The nose wanted to drop. The wheels touched grass. Howell pulled the stick back, keeping the tail wheel up, letting the friction of the main gear slow the aircraft. The grass strip rushed past. The far fence was approaching fast, maybe 800 feet ahead. He stood on the brakes. The wheels locked, skidded on wet grass, carved muddy furrows. The P-47 stopped with less than 200 feet of runway remaining. Howell sat in the cockpit for a moment, breathing, his hand still gripping the stick and throttle, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. His engine was silent. Wind whistled through the holes in his fuselage. Oil dripped from the cowling onto the grass below, making dark stains. He unbuckled his harness, opened the canopy, climbed out onto the wing. His legs were shaky. The ground crew was running across the field toward him, led by a sergeant with gray hair and rolled-up sleeves. The sergeant reached the plane, looked at the battle damage, looked at Howell, and said in a thick Yorkshire accent, "Bloody hell, Lieutenant. You fly all the way from France like this?" "Most of the way," Howell said. McKendrick's flight landed 10 minutes later on the actual runway, concrete and proper, next to the grass emergency strip. McKendrick climbed out of his aircraft and walked over to where Howell stood beside the damaged P-47. He circled the plane slowly, examining the cannon damage, the oil-stained engine, the torn metal. Finally, he stopped in front of Howell and said, "3 aircraft engaged you?" "Yes, sir." "And you shot one down?" "Yes, sir." "How?" Howell explained the throttle reduction, the overshoot, the 3-second window when the Messerschmitt was vulnerable. McKendrick listened without interrupting. When Howell finished, the captain was quiet for a long moment. "They teach that at Purdue?" McKendrick finally asked. "No, sir. They teach energy equations and relative motion. The application was improvised." McKendrick almost smiled. "The other 2 broke off after you got the first one?" "Yes, sir. I think seeing their lead go down made them reconsider the engagement." "I think so, too." McKendrick extended his hand. Howell shook it. "That was smart flying, Lieutenant. Unconventional, but smart. I'll make sure it goes in my after-action report." The after-action report hit 56th Fighter Group headquarters 2 days later. It included McKendrick's account, testimony from the ground crew who examined Howell's aircraft, and gun camera footage that confirmed the kill. The footage showed exactly what Howell had described: the throttle reduction, the Germans overtake and overshoot, the 3-second firing opportunity, the Messerschmitt tumbling away trailing smoke. The group commander, Colonel Hubert Zemke, watched the gun camera footage 3 times. Then he called Howell to his office. Zemke was a legend, a fighter pilot's fighter pilot, a man who'd shot down 17 German aircraft and trained 2 generations of American pilots in combat tactics. He sat behind a desk covered with maps and reports, his uniform jacket unbuttoned, a cigarette burning in an ashtray beside him. "Sit down, Lieutenant," Zemke said. Howell sat. Zemke tapped the after-action report. "Tell me about the throttle reduction technique. Where did you learn it?" "I didn't learn it anywhere, sir. I calculated it during the engagement." "You calculated it?" Zemke's tone was neutral, impossible to read. "While being shot at by 3 aircraft?" "Yes, sir. The math is straightforward once you understand the variables. Relative velocity, closure rate, reaction time." Zemke held up a hand. "I understand the math, Lieutenant. What I want to know is why you thought this would work when every other pilot would have tried to run or fight." Howell considered the question. "Because running would have failed, sir. My engine was damaged. Fighting 3 aircraft would have failed. That left only one option: change the geometry of the engagement in a way the enemy couldn't predict or counter." Zemke picked up his cigarette, took a drag, exhaled smoke toward the ceiling. "You're aware this violates every principle we teach in fighter tactics school?" "Yes, sir. Speed is life. Never slow down when you're being chased. These aren't suggestions, Lieutenant. They're rules that keep pilots alive." "Yes, sir. But rules are context-dependent. In most situations, those principles are correct. In my specific situation, they were wrong." Zemke studied him for a long moment. Then he smiled, a brief hard smile. You know what I think, Lieutenant? I think you're either very smart or very lucky. Why didn't you say anything? You could have told McKendrick you were protecting your element leader. Would have made you look good. After the war, he returned to Purdue, finished his engineering degree, and spent 30 years designing aircraft for Lockheed. He worked on the F-104 Starfighter, the U-2 spy plane, and contributed to early designs for what would become the State Route 71 Blackbird. He never talked much about the war. When younger engineers asked him about combat, he usually changed the subject. But once, late in his career, a young aerospace engineer asked him what he'd learned from being a fighter pilot. Howell had thought about it for a moment, then said, "I learned that the best solution is almost never the obvious solution, and that mathematics doesn't care about your fear. The equations work whether you're calm or terrified. You just have to trust them." The story of Lieutenant James Howell and the throttle reduction technique became a footnote in aviation history, a curious anecdote that instructors told to illustrate creative thinking in tactical situations. But for the pilots who flew with him, and for the pilots who learned from his example, it meant something more, that intelligence and timing could be as valuable as firepower, that sometimes survival required doing the opposite of what every instinct demanded, that the rules that kept you alive in most situations could kill you in others. On April 17, 1944, over occupied France, a young lieutenant with glasses and an engineering degree proved something that veteran pilots had always known but rarely articulated. That war in the air wasn't just about courage or reflexes or even experience. It was also about understanding the physics of flight so deeply that you could see solutions invisible to others, could calculate survival in the seconds between life and death, could turn mathematics into a weapon as effective as any gun. If you enjoy real World War II stories, where skill and courage change history, subscribe for more. The question isn't whether you have the nerve to pull the throttle back when death is chasing you. The question is whether you trust the mathematics enough to bet your life on them. James Howell did, and because he did, he lived to tell about it. How many opportunities for survival pass us by simply because they look too much like surrender?